Hey guys, tonight we are going to ease into a history that feels both completely alien and strangely relevant to our world today. Imagine, if you can, stepping back, way back, not just years or decades, but centuries. You find yourself standing on the edge of a vast, shimmering lake under a sky so clear it almost hurts your eyes. The air smells damp, maybe a little fishy, and carries the distant buzz of a city. But this isn't just any city on a lake. As you look out, you see a metropolis rising directly from the water itself, a network of canals, towering temples and buildings sprawling outwards onto surfaces that look, well, they look like floating gardens. It's beautiful, utterly unique, and frankly, if you were there without knowing the language or where you were going, you probably wouldn't survive the first day. Getting around was tricky enough even if you did know what you were doing. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. I love seeing how far these sleepy history dives travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing on what will become modern-day Mexico City, but right now you're witnessing the Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan, perhaps around the early 1500s, just before everything changed. It's less a solid land mass with some water features and more a city built on the water. Not just next to a river or harbour, but smack in the middle of a large shallow lake system known collectively as Lake Texcoco. Think Venice, but on a much, much larger scale with pyramids, and fewer gondolas playing accordions, more, well, we'll get to that. This location was chosen for complex reasons, wrapped up in prophecy and history. The story goes that the Mexica people, the ancestors of the Aztecs we're talking about, were guided by their god Huitzilopochtli to find a sign, an eagle perched on a prickly pear cactus, devouring a snake. After years of wandering, they saw this very sight on a small island in the middle of Lake Texcoco. All right, they probably thought, this looks damp, but the eagle says so. And thus, Tenochtitlan was founded on this unlikely spot in 1325 CE. Mainstream historical fact number 1, the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan was built on an island in Lake Texcoco. It's a foundational piece of their identity, but also, let's be honest, a massive headache for urban planning and, crucially, farming. Because you're an island city, what do you eat? Unless you're planning on a diet consisting solely of lake fish and slightly too soggy cactus, which, let's face it, gets old fast, you've got a problem. Land is scarce. The small island they started on, and even the larger island it eventually grew into, couldn't possibly support the food needs of a population that, over a couple of centuries, would swell into the hundreds of thousands. How many hundreds of thousands? Well, historians still argue whether the peak population of Tenochtitlan was closer to 200,000 or pushing towards 400,000 or even higher before the Spanish arrived. That's a significant difference when you're trying to figure out dinner plans for everyone. And the lake itself wasn't exactly a uniform, friendly body of water. Lake Texcoco was part of a basin where 5 distinct lakes met and mingled. Some parts were fresh water fed by mountain streams. Other parts were brackish, even salty, because it was a closed basin with high evaporation rates. This meant the water levels fluctuated, and saltwater intrusion was a constant threat to any attempts at using the water for irrigation, or just, drinking without making that face you make when you accidentally get seawater in your mouth at the beach. Imagine building your entire civilization knowing that a bad rainy season or particularly dry spell could mess everything up. Adds a certain level of stress to your day, right? Is the lake too high today? Or not high enough? Will my foundations dissolve? Will we all become human-sized salt shakers? It's enough to make you want to just build your city on solid ground, like boring people do. But the eagle said here. So here it was. The Aztec engineers and planners weren't just building on an island. They were building into the lake. They used fill and causeways to expand the city's footprint, but conventional farming land remained incredibly limited. The sheer density of the urban core meant every available inch of dry, or dryish, land was needed for temples, palaces, markets, houses, and those all-important ball courts where losing probably meant a rather permanent timeout. A quirky tidbit: while the causeways were engineering marvels connecting the island city to the mainland, they also served as crucial barriers. The Aztecs built sophisticated dikes, notably one ordered by the Emperor Nezahualcoyotl, stretching miles across the lake, to separate the freshwater sources from the brackish parts near the city, protecting their drinking water and, yes, their agricultural efforts from salinity. Building a city on a lake is one thing, building a giant wall across a lake to keep your water fresh is a whole other level of, okay, maybe these guys were onto something. So you have this bustling, vibrant, growing city sitting on an island in a complex, sometimes salty lake. You need to feed a massive population without much land. Imports from the mainland helped, sure, but relying entirely on outside sources for your food security when you're the heart of an empire? Not a great long-term strategy, especially when transportation relied on those same lake waters. They needed a way to create more land, and not just land, but incredibly fertile, productive land, right where they needed it. Close to the city, easily accessible by canoe. Land that could laugh in the face of a little lake water, the right kind of lake water anyway. Land that could maybe even float. The challenge was immense. How do you turn a marshy, unstable lake bed into stable, incredibly fertile farmland capable of producing multiple harvests a year? This wasn't just about digging a few garden beds. This was about inventing an entirely new agricultural landscape, one that worked with the water, not against it. It required a deep understanding of the lake's ecosystem, clever engineering, and a whole lot of manual labor. It demanded an innovation that would become one of the defining features of Aztec civilization, the chinampa, a farming method so ingenious it allowed them to feed an empire from a swamp. And that, my friends, is where our story is really heading. Thinking about how they even conceived of such a thing, the basic idea of creating a floating farm is the first step in understanding the incredible knowledge these Aztec gardeners possessed. You need a way to create fertile, productive land, and the answer, the Aztec answer, was the chinampa. Imagine standing by the edge of the lake, watching someone build what looks like a giant rectangular basket in the shallow water. That's the start. They're not just throwing dirt into the lake. This is a sophisticated process, building upwards from the lake bed itself. Think of it less like something that floats freely like a lily pad, and more like a super fertile, anchored, artificial island. The first step is to mark out a rectangular area in the marshy, shallow lake bed. These weren't tiny patches. They could be quite large, perhaps 30 feet wide and over 300 feet long. That's like building a floating football field. Or maybe a really long, narrow soccer field, if we're being precise. You start by driving long stakes, often made from sturdy reeds or willow branches, deep into the lake bed around the perimeter of your chosen rectangle. These stakes are crucial. They define the shape and provide the initial structure. They act like a fence, a container for the magic that's about to happen inside. Now comes the filling. This is where the genius, and perhaps a little bit of the gross-out factor, comes in. The space enclosed by the stakes is filled layer by layer with organic material. You scoop up the incredibly rich muck from the bottom of the lake, sediment, decaying plants, all that good stuff. You add more decaying vegetation, reeds, weeds, whatever is abundant nearby. Sometimes even human waste was added, providing a nitrogen boost that would make modern organic farmers green with envy and maybe a little nauseous. It's like making a giant, incredibly fertile compost sandwich on the lake. This layering is key. It creates a rich, dark, crumbly soil over time. Mainstream historical fact: chinampas were built using layers of lake mud, decaying vegetation, and other organic materials contained within a framework of stakes and reeds. This process created an exceptionally fertile growing medium. As you pile on the layers, mud, reeds, more mud, maybe some repurposed human manure, the level of the chinampa rises above the waterline. The stakes hold it all together, preventing the sides from slumping back into the lake. Eventually you have a raised bed, a long, narrow strip of incredibly rich soil sticking out of the water. But it's not just the raised soil that makes it work. The proximity to the water is vital. Because the chinampa is surrounded by water, the roots of the plants growing in it can easily access moisture. No need for complex irrigation canals running for miles. The water is literally right there, wicking up into the soil. It's like having a self-watering planter on a massive scale. To make the chinampa truly stable and long-lasting, they'd often plant trees, particularly willows, known as ahuejude, along the edges. These trees grow quickly, and their dense root systems interlock, binding the structure together like natural rebar. Over time, these trees formed living walls, further reinforcing the chinampa and preventing erosion. Plus, they looked nice, providing some shade and habitat. It's a bit like building a retaining wall out of trees, practical and aesthetically pleasing if you're into that sort of thing. A quirky tidbit about this process: because the lake bed was relatively shallow in the Chinampa zones, these structures weren't truly floating in the sense of drifting freely. They were anchored firmly to the bottom by the sheer weight of the material and the stakes, effectively turning shallow lake areas into permanent, highly productive land. Though, historians still argue whether some of the earlier or more rudimentary forms might have had a greater degree of actual buoyancy before being fully consolidated. Were they slightly bobbing? We might never know for sure, but picturing a field of slightly wobbly potato plants is kind of amusing. The cleverness here isn't just in building the land, it's in how you maintain its fertility. The lake water, especially in the freshwater zones separated by those dikes we talked about, was rich in nutrients. By scooping up the lake muck periodically and adding it to the Chinampa surface, you're constantly replenishing the soil. It's a continuous cycle of dredging and depositing, ensuring the beds remain incredibly fertile year after year, harvest after harvest. No need for synthetic fertilizers or resting the land. The lake provides the nutrients. It's an agricultural system perfectly integrated with its unique environment. And because the soil is so rich and the water supply is constant and easily managed, either by letting it wick up or, for some crops, occasionally building small channels onto the beds, these Chinampas were unbelievably productive. They could often yield 7 or even 8 harvests per year for certain crops. Compare that to traditional rain-fed agriculture where you might get 1 or 2. It's like going from dial-up internet to fibre optic. Suddenly everything is faster and you can produce way more. This hyper-productivity is what allowed the Aztecs to feed their massive urban population from a relatively limited area around the city. They didn't just make land, they made superland. So you have these long, narrow, raised islands stretching across the lake, separated by narrow canals just wide enough for a canoe to pass through. These stakes and willow trees form the edges, the dark, rich soil covers the top, and the lake water laps gently at the sides. They must have been a sight to behold, a mosaic of green and brown against the blue of the water, stretching for miles, a testament to human ingenuity in the face of environmental constraints. Imagine the buzzing of the insects, the splash of paddles, the calls of farmers working the soil, all happening on land they built. It's a far cry from ploughing fields on solid ground. It's farming on water, but with a very solid foundation underneath, even if the word floating does sound a bit more exciting. Now that the structure is built, anchored, and reinforced by those fast-growing willow roots you planted, you have this incredible piece of land, a long strip of dark, rich soil practically humming with fertility surrounded by calm water. What do you do with it? You farm it, of course. Life on the Chinampas was a rhythm dictated by the sun, the seasons, and the demands of feeding a growing city. Imagine stepping onto your Chinampa in the early morning, the mist just lifting off the water. The air is damp and smells of rich earth and decaying organic matter. A bit earthy, perhaps a bit swampy, but in a productive way. The only sounds are the gentle lapping of water against the sides, the calls of waterfowl and the distant murmur of city life. Your feet sink slightly into the soft, dark soil. It's incredibly fertile, packed with nutrients, thanks to that lovely mix of lake muck and organic compost we talked about building it with. You can almost feel the potential for growth bubbling up from below. The Chinampa is narrow, maybe just wide enough for you to work comfortably from one side, reaching into the middle without needing to wade into the water unless you're heading to the other edge. The narrow canals separating the Chinampas are your highways. You'd get around primarily by canoe, paddling between your different plots or taking your produce to market. Forget traffic jams. Your biggest worry is probably bumping into a heron or getting splashed by a zealous neighbour. The crops grown on these floating gardens were incredibly diverse and formed the backbone of the Aztec diet. The staples were, of course, maize, corn, beans, and squash, often referred to as the Three Sisters by many Mesoamerican cultures because they grew so well together. The cornstalks provide a pole for the beans to climb, the squash leaves shade the ground, reducing weeds and retaining moisture, and the beans fix nitrogen in the soil, benefiting all three. It's agricultural synergy at its finest, like a perfectly choreographed dance where everyone helps each other out. But they grew much more than just the basics. You'd see chilies of various types, tomatoes, amaranth, chia, sweet potatoes, various greens and flowers. Flowers were really important, not just for beauty or offerings to the gods, but also for dyes and medicinal purposes. A mainstream historical fact about Chinampas: they were used to cultivate a wide variety of crops, including maize, beans, squash, chili peppers, tomatoes, and flowers, providing the primary food source for the massive city of Tenochtitlan. Because the soil was so rich and the water was constantly available, you could practice intensive cultivation. This wasn't just planting a seed and hoping for the best. It was carefully managed, continuous production. One technique involved using seedbeds or nurseries on the Chinampa itself. You'd start seedlings in small square or rectangular clumps of mud from the lake bed, often mixed with compost. These mud squares were like little starter pots. Once the seedlings were strong enough, you'd transplant them directly into the main Chinampa bed. This meant you weren't waiting for one crop to finish before starting the next. You had seedlings ready to go the moment a section of the Chinampa was free. It's basically speed farming, ensuring the land was producing something almost all the time. Imagine the efficiency. As soon as you harvest your squash, boom, you're planting the next round of maize seedlings you already had growing on the side. The constant access to water meant they didn't have to rely solely on rain. If the Chinampa soil started to dry out on the surface, the moisture from the surrounding lake would wick up. For some crops, or during particularly dry spells, though within the lake system that wasn't usually the main issue, you could easily use a scoop or a simple irrigation channel to get water onto the beds. Weeding was also relatively manageable because of the controlled environment and the dense planting. Plus, with the fertility constantly being replenished, the crops grew vigorously, outcompeting many weeds. The sheer productivity of this system is hard to overstate. As mentioned before, getting multiple harvests per year was common, sometimes up to 7 or 8 for fast-growing crops like greens or chilies. This output per acre, or per Chinampa section, was vastly higher than traditional farming on drier land. It's estimated that a single Chinampa could support several families, and collectively they provided enough food for a population that grew to possibly 200,000 people or more in Tenochtitlan and its surroundings. That's like feeding a medium-sized modern city using essentially manually built islands made of mud and plants. Pretty impressive, right? It makes your backyard vegetable patch look like a hobby project. A quirky or fringe tidbit about life on the Chinampas is the potential for unexpected animal encounters. While they were farming, the surrounding lake was teeming with life. Fish, turtles, various birds, and even in some areas, amphibians and reptiles. It wasn't just a farm, it was also part of a vibrant ecosystem. Farmers would share their space with nature, which provided both challenges, like birds eating seeds, and benefits, like natural pest control from frogs or snakes. It gives a new meaning to farm to table, when the table is also part of the lake system where the fish you might eat are swimming. Maintaining the Chinampas was a continuous effort. You weren't just planting and harvesting, you were constantly managing the water levels in the canals, sometimes using simple gates or barriers, though larger-scale water control involved the major dikes of the city. Dredging muck from the canals to refresh the soil, replanting the willow stakes or trees as needed, and transporting materials and produce by canoe. It was a physically demanding life, but one directly tied to the incredible bounty it produced. Historians still argue whether the Chinampa system was primarily developed as a response to land scarcity, or if its incredible productivity was the main driving force for its expansion. Was it born of necessity or opportunity? It's a bit like asking if we invented smartphones because we needed better communication or because, gosh darn it, cat videos are just too important to wait for. So imagine the rhythm of the day. Paddling out in your canoe, working the soil, harvesting vibrant crops, perhaps trading with a neighbour from their adjacent Chinampa across the narrow canal, and finally loading up your boat with fresh produce to take to the bustling city markets. It was a unique way of life, utterly integrated with the aquatic environment, a testament to human adaptation and ingenuity that turned a watery challenge into an agricultural powerhouse. It's a system that makes you wonder what other impossible farming methods are out there, waiting to be discovered, or perhaps rediscovered. So you're there, standing on your productive little patch of paradise, knee-deep in potential, surrounded by water. But this water isn't just a pleasant view or a convenient pathway. It's an active, dynamic system that the Aztec farmers didn't just live by. They actively managed and controlled. Think of it less like a lake and more like a complex network of watery highways and reservoirs, all interconnected, but some areas carefully partitioned off from others. The Valley of Mexico, where Tenochtitlan sat, wasn't a single body of water, but a series of 5 interconnected lakes, each with different characteristics. In the north, you had larger, saltier lakes. In the south, where the Chinampas were most prevalent, were freshwater lakes fed by rivers and springs. This difference in salinity was a big deal. You don't want salty water messing up your crops, do you? That juicy maize needs fresh H2O. Maintaining this delicate balance between the freshwater farming zones and the salty northern lakes required engineering on a scale that would impress even modern city planners. We're not just talking about digging a few ditches here and there. The Aztecs, particularly under rulers like Nezahualcoyotl, a poet king and serious engineer, basically the Bob the Builder of the Aztec world, but with more feathered headdresses, undertook massive public works projects. The most famous of these was a huge dike, sometimes called the Albarradón de Nezahualcoyotl, built across the lake system. This thing was like a giant aquatic wall, designed to separate the freshwater areas in the south from the brackish or saltwater lakes in the north, and also to help control water levels during flooding. It was made of stone, earth, reeds and wood, a solid barrier stretching for miles. Imagine building something like that without heavy machinery, just human hands, simple tools and a whole lot of mud and determination. It makes assembling IKEA furniture look like a walk in the park. A mainstream historical fact is that the Aztecs constructed extensive dikes and causeways across the Lake Texcoco system to manage water levels, prevent flooding and separate freshwater areas from saline ones, enabling large-scale Chinampa agriculture. These dikes didn't just block water, they often had gates or sluices that could be opened or closed to allow canoes to pass or to regulate water flow. This was crucial for controlling flooding, which was a constant threat in a city built on a lake. Too much rain, your Chinampas could be submerged. Too little, and the water levels might drop too low in the canals, making transport difficult and reducing the natural wicking of moisture into the soil. The dikes were like giant thermostats for the lake, trying to keep things just right for farming and city life. Within the Chinampa zones themselves, the network of canals was just as vital as the dikes. These were more than just ditches separating the plots. They were the source of the incredibly fertile mud used to build and replenish the Chinampas, the transport routes for farmers and their produce, and the immediate water supply for the crops. The constant presence of water right next to the cultivated beds was the secret source of Chinampa productivity. The soil on the Chinampa was elevated slightly above the canal water level, but the porous nature of the constructed land allowed water to seep up into the root zones of the plants through capillary action. It was like having a self-watering planter on a massive scale. If a section of the Chinampa needed a bit more water, perhaps for thirsty seedlings or during a dry spell, rare but possible within the microclimate, it was simple enough. You might use a scoop or a bucket to draw water directly from the surrounding canal and pour it onto the beds. Sometimes particularly clever farmers might use temporary blockages or small channels to direct water more specifically within their plot, a form of micro-irrigation perfectly suited to the Chinampa environment. The water wasn't just for irrigation, it was also a vital part of the nutrient cycle, carrying the rich organic matter that settled at the bottom of the canals and was then dredged up to refresh the soil. A quirky or fringe tidbit about managing the water system is the role played by aquatic plants and animals. The canals weren't sterile ditches, they were thriving ecosystems. Plants like water hyacinth or reeds could be used to help stabilize the edges of the Chinampas or dikes. The fish and other aquatic life within the canals contributed to the nutrient richness of the water and the mud, acting as a sort of slow-release fertilizer system. It was an integrated system where the farming wasn't separate from the environment, it was deeply intertwined with it. Imagine your compost bin also containing fish and reeds, and you're getting close. This level of sophisticated water management demonstrates a deep understanding of hydrology and ecology. It wasn't just about building things, it was about understanding how the entire lake system worked and manipulating it to their advantage. Historians still argue whether the precise methods for operating the gates in the dikes for regulating water levels and flows were centrally controlled by the Aztec state or managed more locally by communities or districts. Was it a top-down command structure or a more communal, distributed effort? The truth is likely somewhere in the muddy middle, probably a mix of large-scale state projects and local practical management by the farmers themselves. It's a bit like debating whether your city council fixes the potholes or if everyone just kinda avoids them individually. The ability to control the water meant the Aztec farmers had a level of resilience that many land-based farmers lacked. They were less susceptible to drought because the water was always there. They could mitigate the effects of flooding, though massive floods still occurred, because of the dikes and their understanding of water flow. This mastery over their environment turning a shallow, potentially challenging lake into the most productive agricultural land in the region was a key factor in the growth and prosperity of Tenochtitlan. It shows that sometimes The biggest obstacles can become your greatest resources if you're clever enough to figure out how to work with them, not just against them. And in this case, it involved a whole lot of mud and some very impressive walls of rock and reeds. So you've painstakingly built your watery field, carefully sectioned off the fresh water, managed the flow with gates and dikes, and now you stand ready. What's all this effort for? Well, this is where the magic truly happens. This isn't just a garden, it's a food-producing engine, capable of astonishing output. The entire point of the Chinampa system, the reason the Aztecs went to all this trouble, was to feed the enormous, rapidly growing population of Tenochtitlan. Imagine a city of maybe 200,000 to 300,000 people. That's bigger than most European cities at the time, all needing breakfast, lunch and dinner. And snacking, don't forget snacking. How do you feed that many people when you're essentially on an island in the middle of a lake? You build more land, and you make that land work hard. The productivity of the Chinampas was legendary, and it's a key reason Tenochtitlan could become such a powerful urban centre. Because you had constant access to water right there in the canals, and because the soil was incredibly fertile from that nutrient-rich mud you dredged up, you weren't limited by seasonal rains or soil depletion in the same way farmers on dry land were. You could plant crops virtually year-round. As soon as one harvest was finishing, you could be starting the next batch of seedlings in special nursery beds, ready to be transplanted into the main Chinampa field. This intensive, continuous cultivation meant that the same patch of land, or water, depending on how you look at it, could yield multiple harvests each year. A mainstream historical fact is that Chinampas allowed for extremely high agricultural yields, often supporting 2 to 7 harvests per year from the same plot, a level of productivity far exceeding traditional farming methods of the era. Think about that. Up to 7 harvests a year from one spot. That's like picking apples in January, peaches in March, strawberries in May, watermelons in July, pumpkins in September, and then, I don't know, maybe frost-resistant kale in November and December. It's wild. It completely changed the economics and logistics of food supply. Instead of waiting a whole season for one crop to mature, you had a rolling conveyor belt of produce constantly coming in. This provided a consistent, reliable food source for the city, helping to buffer against famine and allowing the population to grow without worrying about starving. What were they growing on these floating powerhouses? The staples, of course. Maize, which was the absolute cornerstone of the Aztec diet, grew tall and proud. Beans would often be planted alongside the maize, climbing up the stalks and helpfully fixing nitrogen in the soil. A classic example of ancient intercropping wisdom that we still use today. Squashes, pumpkins, chilies for that essential spice, those tomatoes, yes, tomatoes, originally from the Americas, remember? Amaranth, chia, and various other vegetables and grains filled the beds. It was a diverse pantry growing right outside the city gates. But it wasn't just food. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that Chinampas were also used extensively for cultivating flowers. Flowers were incredibly important in Aztec society, not just for their beauty, but for religious offerings, ceremonies, decorations, and even as symbols of status. Entire Chinampa plots were dedicated solely to growing vibrant blooms for the markets and temples of Tenochtitlan. Imagine canals filled with canoes piled high, not just with corn and beans, but with masses of marigolds, dahlias, and other blossoms paddling into the city. It adds a whole layer of colour and fragrance to the picture of this watery metropolis, making it smell a bit less like a marsh and a bit more like a giant, beautiful garden centre. The technique for getting these multiple harvests wasn't just luck, it was skilled gardening. Farmers would often start seeds in protected seedbeds, maybe made of reed mats covered in that rich mud. Once the seedlings were sturdy, they'd carefully transplant them into the main Chinampa beds. This meant you didn't lose growing time waiting for seeds to germinate and sprout in the open field. You had healthy young plants ready to go as soon as the previous crop was harvested. And because you had that amazing, perpetually fertile soil, constantly topped up with canal mud and reliable water access, the plants grew quickly and strongly. It was high-intensity farming, cushion requiring constant attention and labour, but the payoff in terms of yield was immense. Compared to farming on dry land, which often relied on slash-and-burn techniques or leaving fields fallow to recover, the Chinampa system was sustainable and hyper-efficient in terms of land use. You were essentially creating new, permanently fertile land and using it non-stop. This allowed a huge urban population to be supported by agriculture happening within or immediately surrounding the city itself, drastically reducing the need to transport vast quantities of food over long distances, though tribute still played a role in the overall food supply, which is part of the debate. Speaking of debates, historians still argue whether the vast scale of Qin Empire production was sufficient on its own to feed Tenochtitlan, or if the city relied heavily on food tribute brought in from conquered territories to supplement its own production. Some scholars believe the Chinampas provided the bulk of the food, especially staple crops, making the city largely self-sufficient in that regard. Others argue that while incredibly productive, the Chinampa zone wasn't large enough to support hundreds of thousands of people without significant external input. It's a bit like wondering if your local farmer's market could feed your entire city for a year, or if you'd still need grocery stores importing food from elsewhere. The truth is likely complex, involving different foods from different sources, but there's no doubt the Chinampas were a foundational element of the city's food security. This constant cycle of planting, growing, harvesting, and replanting transformed the southern part of the lake into a checkerboard of vibrant green, brown, and yellow patches, crisscrossed by waterways. It was a landscape shaped entirely by human hands and ingenuity, a testament to what you can achieve when you figure out how to work with, rather than fight, the environment around you. And it smells pretty good too, especially when the flower Chinampas are in bloom. Just try not to get mud on your nice sandals. So you've painstakingly built your watery field, carefully sectioned off the fresh water, managed the flow with gates and dikes, and now you stand ready. What's all this effort for? Well, this is where the magic truly happens. This isn't just a garden, it's a food-producing engine, capable of astonishing output. The entire point of the Chinampa system, the reason the Aztecs went to all this trouble, was to feed the enormous, rapidly growing population of Tenochtitlan. Imagine a city of maybe 200,000 to 300,000 people. That's bigger than most European cities at the time, all needing breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And snacking, don't forget snacking. How do you feed that many people when you're essentially on an island in the middle of a lake? You build more land, and you make that land work hard. The productivity of the Chinampas was legendary, and it's a key reason Tenochtitlan could become such a powerful urban centre, because you had constant access to water right there in the canals, and because the soil was incredibly fertile from that nutrient-rich mud you dredged up. You weren't limited by seasonal rains or soil depletion in the same way farmers on dry land were. You could plant crops virtually year-round. As soon as one harvest was finishing, you could be starting the next batch of seedlings in special nursery beds, ready to be transplanted into the main Chinampa field. This intensive, continuous cultivation meant that the same patch of land or water, depending on how you look at it, could yield multiple harvests each year. A mainstream historical fact is that Chinampas allowed for extremely high agricultural yields, often supporting 2 to 7 harvests per year from the same plot, a level of productivity far exceeding traditional farming methods of the era. Think about that. Up to 7 harvests a year from one spot. That's like picking apples in January, peaches in March, strawberries in May, watermelons in July, pumpkins in September, and then, I don't know, maybe frost-resistant kale in November and December. It's wild. It completely changed the economics and logistics of food supply. Instead of waiting a whole season for one crop to mature, you had a rolling conveyor belt of produce constantly coming in. This provided a consistent, reliable food source for the city, helping to buffer against famine and allowing the population to grow without worrying about starving. What were they growing on these floating powerhouses? The staples, of course. Maize, which was the absolute cornerstone of the Aztec diet, grew tall and proud. Beans would often be planted alongside the maize, climbing up the stalks and helpfully fixing nitrogen in the soil, a classic example of an intercropping wisdom that we still use today. Squashes, pumpkins, chilies for that essential spice, tomatoes, yes, tomatoes, originally from the Americas, remember? Amaranth, chia, and various other vegetables and grains filled the beds. It was a diverse pantry growing right outside the city gates. But it wasn't just food. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that Chinampas were also used extensively for cultivating flowers. Flowers were incredibly important in Aztec society, not just for their beauty, but for religious offerings, ceremonies, decorations, and even as symbols of status. Entire Chinampa plots were dedicated solely to growing vibrant blooms for the markets and temples of Tenochtitlan. Imagine canals filled with canoes piled high, Not just with corn and beans, but with the masses of marigolds, dahlias, and other blossoms paddling into the city. It adds a whole layer of colour and fragrance to the picture of this watery metropolis, making it smell a bit less like a marsh and a bit more like a giant, beautiful garden centre. The technique for getting these multiple harvests wasn't just luck. It was skilled gardening. Farmers would often start seeds in protected seedbeds, maybe made of reed mats covered in that rich mud. Once the seedlings were sturdy, they'd carefully transplant them into the main chinampa beds. This meant you didn't lose growing time waiting for seeds to germinate and sprout in the open field. You had healthy young plants ready to go as soon as the previous crop was harvested. And because you had that amazing, perpetually fertile soil, constantly topped up with canal mud, and reliable water access, the plants grew quickly and strongly. It was high-intensity farming requiring constant attention and labour, but the payoff in terms of yield was immense. Compared to farming on dry land, which often relied on slash-and-burn techniques or leaving fields fallow to recover, the chinampa system was sustainable and hyper-efficient in terms of land use. You were essentially creating new, permanently fertile land and using it non-stop. This allowed a huge urban population to be supported by agriculture happening within or immediately surrounding the city itself, drastically reducing the need to transport vast quantities of food over long distances, though tribute still played a role in the overall food supply, which is part of the debate. Speaking of debates, historians still argue whether the vast scale of chinampa production was sufficient on its own to feed Tenochtitlan, or if the city relied heavily on food tribute brought in from conquered territories to supplement its own production. Some scholars believe the chinampas provided the bulk of the food, especially staple crops, making the city largely self-sufficient in that regard. Others argue that while incredibly productive, the chinampa zone wasn't large enough to support hundreds of thousands of people without significant external input. It's a bit like wondering if your local farmer's market could feed your entire city for a year, or if you'd still need grocery stores importing food from elsewhere. The truth is likely complex, involving different foods from different sources, but there's no doubt the chinampas were a foundational element of the city's food security. This constant cycle of planting, growing, harvesting, and replanting transformed the southern part of the lake into a checkerboard of vibrant green, brown, and yellow patches, crisscrossed by waterways. It was a landscape shaped entirely by human hands and ingenuity, a testament to what you can achieve when you figure out how to work with rather than fight the environment around you. And it smells pretty good too, especially when the flower chinampas are in bloom. Just try not to get mud on your nice sandals. So you've been working hard all day, scooping mud, planting seedlings, battling pests, living that chinampa life. It was demanding, yes, but what was the cumulative effect of all this relentless work? What happens when thousands upon thousands of people are literally reshaping their environment day after day, year after year? You weren't just cultivating small gardens. You were participating in a massive ongoing act of landscape engineering that fundamentally altered the very nature of the lake itself. Imagine looking out across Lake Texcoco before the Aztecs really got going. It was a large, complex system of interconnected lakes, parts fresh, parts brackish, a vast expanse of open water and marshland. Now, fast forward a couple of centuries and look again. That open water is broken up, crisscrossed by a grid of narrow canals and defined by the hard edges of countless rectangular islands. It's like someone took a giant muddy ruler and drew a massive, geometric pattern across the water's surface. This wasn't just a change in how people lived, it was a radical restructuring of the ecosystem. A mainstream historical fact is that the construction of the Chinampa system transformed a significant portion of the lake basin into an anthropogenic landscape, a human-made environment designed specifically for agriculture. The sheer scale of it is hard to wrap your head around. You're not talking about a few isolated plots. You're talking about square mile after square mile of these highly modified wetlands. The natural marsh gave way to ordered lines of cultivation. The open water was confined into channels. This had profound effects, both intended and unintended, on the lake's environment. For one, those canals you navigated in your canoe, they became important parts of the ecosystem themselves. They provided a habitat for fish, amphibians, and aquatic insects. They acted as natural irrigation channels, keeping the soil of the Chinampas moist from below, and the process of dredging them, while hard work, also served to keep the channels open and navigable, preventing them from silting up too quickly. It was a reciprocal relationship. The channels supported the Chinampas, and maintaining the Chinampas maintained the channels. Pretty neat, right? Like a perpetual motion machine, but for mud and veggies. And sawbacks. However, changing such a large natural system isn't without consequences. While the chinampas were incredibly productive, they also concentrated nutrients. All that rich mud being piled on, all the plant matter, all the intensive growth, it created a very fertile but also potentially fragile environment. Think about water quality. While the canals might have helped cycle nutrients, the sheer volume of organic matter and human activity surely had an impact. Runoff from the chinampas would enter the canals and the surrounding lake water. What effect did this have on algae blooms, oxygen levels, or the balance of aquatic life in the wider lake? A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some researchers have speculated that the extensive chinampa system, with its dense network of canals, might have actually helped to regulate the water levels and flow within certain parts of the lake system, acting as a kind of massive, unintentional wetland management system. The channels and the landmass influenced how water moved and perhaps even helped filter it to some extent, but this is still an area of ongoing study. Consider the biodiversity. The large open lake was home to many species adapted to that specific environment. As it was carved up into channels and fields, some species would have suffered, losing their habitat. Others, however, might have thrived in the new niche created by the chinampas and their surrounding canals. Ducks and other waterfowl would have found rich feeding grounds in the channels and the adjacent waters. Fish that could tolerate shallower, perhaps more nutrient-rich water would have flourished. The sheer volume of food being grown would have supported a huge population of insects, which in turn would have supported insect-eating birds. It was a dramatic shift in the ecological balance, favouring species that could adapt to a human-dominated landscape. It's basically taking a wild marsh and turning it into a very effective, slightly muddy wildlife buffet, if you were the right kind of animal. Historians still argue whether the scale of the chinampas ultimately contributed to the environmental degradation of the lake system, particularly in terms of increased salinity in certain areas or changes in water chemistry, or if the system was remarkably sustainable for its time, only facing collapse due to external factors like the Spanish conquest and subsequent changes in water management. Did the Aztecs fully understand the long-term environmental impacts of their large-scale transformation? Or were they simply focused on feeding their booming population? It's a complex question with no easy answer. The environmental impact was undeniable. The Aztecs didn't just build a city, they built a whole new kind of landscape, a hybrid world of water and earth that blurred the lines between nature and human construction. The lake was no longer a passive backdrop. It was an active partner in their agricultural success, but also a system under immense pressure from their intensive methods. Think of it like turning a wild forest into a managed park. It's still green, there are still animals, but it's a fundamentally different place, shaped by human hands and human needs. And in the case of the chinampas, those needs were enormous, pushing the lake ecosystem to its limits, creating one of the most productive, yet perhaps one of the most heavily engineered environments in the pre-Columbian Americas. It's a testament to human ingenuity, but also a stark reminder of how profoundly we can reshape the world around us, sometimes for better, sometimes it just gets complicated, like trying to assemble IKEA furniture after midnight. So you've witnessed the incredible transformation of the landscape, seen the scale of the project you're a part of, how the lake is no longer just water and marsh, but a geometric patchwork of human-made islands. But creating this wasn't a one-time build. It was more like owning a really high-maintenance pet that also happens to grow your dinner. Keeping these floating farms, or rather staked-down islands, productive wasn't just about planting seeds and waiting for stuff to grow. Oh no! It was a relentless, never-ending cycle of upkeep, a constant battle against nature trying to reclaim what you'd painstakingly built. Imagine waking up every morning knowing your work isn't just planting or harvesting, but also sustaining the very ground you stand on. The biggest, most fundamental task was dredging. Those narrow canals that provide access and irrigation, they're also the source of the incredibly rich soil that makes your chinampa so fertile. Year after year, organic matter settles on the bottom, decaying plants, sediment washed in, even, well, let's just say nutrient-rich waste from the city upstream. This stuff turns into a black, incredibly fertile mud, often called asuhuatl, or tlalpatlachtli. You spend hours poling your canoe slowly along the channels, leaning over the edge, scooping up this kagok oozy mud from the bottom with a long pole or a specially designed net or scoop. It's heavy work, muscle straining, the smell of damp earth and water filling your nostrils. You pile the mud carefully into your canoe, trying not to tip over, a precarious balancing act you've mastered over years. Once your canoe is loaded, you paddle back to your plot. Then comes the next part of the cycle, applying the mud. You shovel or scoop the dark, nutrient-rich goo onto the surface of your chinampa. This isn't just adding dirt, it's like giving your farm a massive yearly vitamin boost. This periodic fertilization is a mainstream historical fact about chinampas. They didn't rely on animal manure as heavily as many other agricultural systems. The fertility came directly from the lake bottom itself. You're essentially farming the lake floor to make your island bloom. It's efficient, it's organic, and it smells like incredibly fertile lake mud, which, depending on your perspective, is either the smell of prosperity or the smell of pure, unadulterated muck, probably both. But the mud doesn't just arrive by magic or a subscription box. You have to get it. And while you're getting it, you're also deepening the canals. This is crucial for navigation, especially during the dry season when water levels might drop slightly. It's also essential for maintaining that perfect water-soil interface, allowing the roots of your crops to reach down to the constant moisture table provided by the channel. So dredging serves two purposes: fertilizer source and channel maintenance. Talk about multitasking. It's the ancient world's version of recycling, but instead of turning old plastic into new stuff, you're turning lake gunky into dinner. Another constant chore is repairing the edges. Remember those woven reed mats and stakes you used to build the chinampa initially? The water, weather, and sheer passage of time take their toll. The stakes rot or shift, the weaving loosens, and the edges start to erode. You have to constantly check the perimeter, driving new stakes, weaving fresh reeds and branches, reinforcing the walls to keep your precious soil from slumping back into the canal. It's like trying to keep a sandcastle intact at high tide, except your sandcastle is your livelihood. Then there are the pests. Just like any farmer anywhere, you deal with insects, birds, maybe even small animals trying to get at your crops. You don't have chemical sprays, obviously. You rely on observation, perhaps encouraging beneficial insects, or sometimes just physically removing pests by hand. It's a constant watchfulness, a dance with the natural world where you try to coax bounty from the soil while fending off everything else that wants a piece of it. This wasn't seasonal work. While planting and harvesting had their peaks, the maintenance, the dredging, the repairing, the weeding was year-round. Even in the drier or cooler periods, there was always something to do. This non-stop labour cycle was the key part of the chinampa system's incredible productivity. You weren't farming for part of the year. You were gardening, stewarding, building your land every single day. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some accounts suggest specific tools were developed solely for chinampa maintenance, like specialized long-handled scoops or even canoe designs optimized for carrying heavy loads of mud. These tools, refined over generations, would have been essential to making the back-breaking work even remotely manageable. Imagine the ancient equivalent of specialized gardening tools, but for operating on a lake. Probably didn't come in cheerful primary colors, though. This constant effort wasn't just physical, it shaped the entire culture and knowledge system of the chinampa farmers. They were experts in soil, water management, plant cycles, and the intricate relationship between their farms and the lake ecosystem. They knew when the mud was ripest for dredging, how high the water needed to be, what plants thrived in which microenvironments on their plots. It was a deep, practical knowledge passed down through families, a living library of how to make a city float on its own food supply. Historians still argue whether the intensive labour required for chinampa maintenance was sustainable in the long term, without the specific social and political structures of the Aztec Empire to organise and incentivise it, or if the system was inherently so efficient that the labour was simply a worthwhile investment for the yield. Was it a burden borne willingly for the collective good, or a grinding necessity that kept people tied to the land? The truth, as always, is probably somewhere in the muddy middle. But one thing is clear. Without the constant dredging, repairing and tending, these incredible floating gardens would simply cease to exist, slowly eroding back into the lake from which they were born. It's like trying to keep a giant, delicious cake from melting. You have to keep frosting, keep decorating, keep it from getting eaten by erosion. Now that the soil is refreshed, the edges are secure and the canals are dredged, a cycle you repeat more often than you'd think possible. It's time for the real magic to begin, planting. This isn't like scattering seeds and hoping for the best. The Aztec gardeners, you among them now, were way more sophisticated. Think of it as ancient agriculture on steroids, or maybe like starting seedlings indoors under grow lights, but instead of a tiny apartment corner, your indoors is the surface of a meticulously prepared island and your grow lights are just, the sun. A truly ingenious technique they used, one that really showcases their advanced understanding of how plants work, involved little seedbeds called almatigos. Imagine small squares, maybe the size of your hand or a bit bigger, made of that same fertile lake mud. You'd form these squares right there on the chinampa, perhaps in a dedicated area near the edge, or even floating on rafts sometimes for specific purposes. You'd carefully sow seeds into these mud squares, maize kernels, bean seeds, squash seeds, chili seeds, all the staples. What's brilliant about this? It gives the seeds a head start. They germinate and grow into sturdy little seedlings in this protected nursery environment before ever being transplanted into the main chinampa beds. This massively increases the survival rate. Instead of a tiny vulnerable sprout trying to fight off pests or variable moisture levels in the open field, you're planting a strong, established young plant. It's like sending a teenager off to college instead of a toddler. Much better odds of success. When the seedlings are ready, you can tell by their size, the strength of their leaves, the look of their roots gripping the mud square. You carefully lift these mud blocks, seedlings and all. You then transport them, usually just by hand or in a basket, to the prepared planting areas on the chinampa. You space them just so, embedding the mud square directly into the soil of the chinampa. It's incredibly efficient and it allows for very dense planting. You're not waiting for seeds to sprout in place. You're putting healthy, growing plants exactly where you want them, maximizing every square foot of your precious garden island. This use of almatigos is a quirky or fringe tidbit that often gets overlooked when people just picture rows of corn. It shows a level of nursery management quite advanced for the time. And because you're using seedlings, and because the climate is forgiving, and most importantly because you have constant access to water and nutrients, you're not limited to just one growing season a year. Oh no! You're planting and harvesting continuously. As soon as one crop is nearing the end of its cycle, you're already preparing the ground and transplanting seedlings for the next one right alongside it or immediately after harvest. You can get multiple harvests of the same crop annually, or cycle through different crops. This intensive cultivation is a mainstream historical fact. Chinampas were astoundingly productive, often yielding several harvests per year compared to one or two on rain-fed land. This level of productivity was essential for feeding the massive growing population of Tenochtitlan. Try getting 3 or 4 corn harvests a year out of your backyard garden. It makes your zucchini bounty look a bit small. The variety of crops is impressive too. Maize is king, of course, the staple that fuels everything. But you're also growing beans, often interplanted with the maize, so the beans can climb the stalks and fix nitrogen in the soil, a clever bit of ancient companion planting. Squashes sprawl along the ground, their broad leaves shading the soil and keeping weeds down. Chilies for spice, tomatoes, yes, tomatoes originated here. Amaranth, chia for energy, various herbs for medicine and flavouring. You might even have small areas dedicated to flowers, not just for beauty, but for religious offerings or dyes. Along the sturdier edges, perhaps a few small trees like avocados or plums that can tolerate the wet conditions. Walking through the chinampas at peak season is a feast for the senses, the tall maize stalks rustling in the breeze, the vibrant green of squash leaves, the splash of red from ripening tomatoes, the pungent smell of chili plants, the hum of insects among the flowers. It's a vibrant, living tapestry, all thanks to your hard work and the incredible fertility of that lake mud you were just scooping up. It feels less like farming and more like managing a giant, perpetually fruiting salad bar. The sheer density of planting is striking. There's very little wasted space. Every inch is utilized. This is possible because the soil is so fertile and the water supply is so reliable. You don't need wide spacing like you might in drier climates where plants have to compete for scarce resources. Here, resources are abundant, allowing the plants to grow close together and thrive. Historians still argue whether the primary purpose of chinampas was simply maximum food production for the city, or if they also served other ecological functions like filtering lake water or providing habitat. While the food aspect is undeniable, the integrated nature of the system suggests there might have been unintended or intended environmental benefits. Was it just about cramming as much food as possible onto small islands, or was there a deeper, almost symbiotic relationship with the lake environment? It's hard to say for sure from this distance, but as you survey your thriving plot, you know you're part of something that works, really works, to produce food day in and day out. It feels sustainable even if it is incredibly labour-intensive. No time for lounging when there's a harvest ready and new seedlings waiting. Pro tip: don't try to sneak a nap amongst the chili plants unless you want a spicy surprise when you wake up. So you've got your sturdy little almazigos tucked into the rich soil. Your crops are pushing up green and vibrant, basking in that strong Mesoamerican sun. You've maximised the space, planted densely, and the air is thick with the promise of bounty. But all this incredible growth, this perpetual harvest we talked about in the last breath, depends on one thing more than any other: water. I know. You're literally floating on the stuff. You're surrounded by it on all four sides, the canals stretching out like watery highways in every direction. You might think, great, my plants can just dip their toes in whenever they're thirsty, but it's not quite that simple. The chinampa beds, remember, are raised above the average water level of the canals. This prevents the plants from being waterlogged all the time, which would kill most of them, especially the precious maize. It also allows for deep, well-aerated soil, where roots can really stretch out. But it means the plant roots aren't constantly submerged. They need a more direct, controlled supply of moisture, especially during the heat of the day or when certain crops are flowering and fruiting heavily. This is where your daily rhythm truly locks in. Irrigation on the chinampas isn't a complex system of pumps or aqueducts running for miles. It's much more immediate, much more you. It's manual labour, pure and simple, but incredibly effective. You grab your tool, which might be a specially shaped gourd, a wide, shallow basket woven tightly enough to hold water for a moment, or even a ceramic scoop, essentially the ancient Aztec equivalent of a watering can, but a lot bigger and without the fancy sprinkler head. You stand by the edge of your chinampa, right next to the canal. The water here is usually calm, reflecting the sky and the lush green of your garden. It might be murky, full of nutrients that have settled from the city upstream. We'll get back to that lovely thought in a bit. But it's lifeblood for your plants. You dip your scoop into the canal, drawing up a good amount of water, maybe a couple of litres or so. Then, with a smooth practice motion, you lift it and pour it directly onto the soil around the base of your plants, or into small irrigation channels you might have briefly dug between rows. You move methodically down the edge of the chinampa, scooping and pouring, scooping and pouring. The water soaks into the soil, quickly disappearing as the thirsty roots draw it up. It's a repetitive task, almost meditative. The only sounds, the gentle slosh of water, the drip from your scoop, and maybe the distant calls of birds or other chinampa dwellers. You might do this section by section, watering one patch thoroughly before moving to the next. This seemingly simple act is performed regularly throughout the day, especially during dry spells or when the sun is particularly fierce. In peak growing season, you might be doing this 2, 3, maybe even 4 times a day for some areas. Your arms get used to the motion, your back develops a certain stoop that you just learn to live with. It's definitely not a set it and forget it system. If you were hoping for automated sprinklers or maybe a little water-carrying drone, you're out of luck. Your body is the technology here. The brilliance lies in the combination of accessibility and control. You have an infinite water source right there, literally at your fingertips or at the tip of your scoop. But by manually applying it, you control exactly how much water each section receives, avoiding overwatering or making sure specific thirstier plants get what they need. It allows for incredibly precise moisture management, which is crucial for maximizing yields and growing different types of crops with varying water requirements all on the same small island. This constant irrigation, coupled with the incredibly fertile soil, remember that lake mud, is why you can achieve those multiple harvests per year. The plants never really experience drought stress. They always have access to the water and nutrients they need to grow rapidly and produce prolifically. This high-frequency irrigation is a key factor enabling the astounding productivity of the chinampa system, a mainstream historical fact that allowed Tenochtitlan to feed its massive population. Think about it, feeding hundreds of thousands, perhaps over 1 million people, primarily from gardens grown on a lake. That takes some serious plant power and serious watering. Now about that water quality. The canals were not just sources of irrigation, they were also part of the city's waste disposal system, receiving runoff and, well, other things. This might sound a bit gross, and honestly, it probably was, but it also meant the water was incredibly rich in organic matter and nutrients. When you're scooping that water onto your chinampa, You're not just hydrating the plants, you're also delivering a constant supply of fertilizer. It's like a natural, albeit somewhat unsanitary nutrient delivery system. This constant inflow of nutrient-rich water, combined with the layering of organic matter and mud, kept the soil fertility incredibly high year after year, harvest after harvest, without the need for synthetic fertilizers because, they hadn't invented those yet. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to this involves the fish and other aquatic life in the canals. The Aztecs actively managed populations of fish, amphibians and insects in the waterways around the Chinampas. These creatures weren't just food sources, they were part of the ecosystem. Fish moving through the canals helped stir up sediment, keeping nutrients suspended. Insects might have helped control pests, or been pests themselves, that part isn't always clear. The canals were a complete integrated system supporting both agriculture and aquaculture, blurring the lines between farming and fishing in a way we rarely see today. Imagine your irrigation ditch also supplying dinner, though you'd probably want to cook it very thoroughly. Historians still argue whether the sheer scale of the labour required to maintain this vast network of canals and Chinampas was the ultimate limiting factor for the system's expansion, or if other factors like disease or political instability played a larger role in its eventual decline after the arrival of the Spanish. Keeping the canals clear of sediment, constantly rebuilding the edges of the Chinampas, and performing that never-ending scooping and watering required an immense organised labour force. Was it sustainable in the long run, or was it a system constantly on the brink of collapse due to its intensive labour demands? It's a big question, one that keeps researchers busy debating the finer points of ancient Aztec logistics and social structures. But for you, standing there with your scoop, arm getting tired from the repetitive motion, it's less about long-term historical sustainability debates and more about getting water to that patch of wilting chili plants before they give up the ghost. The sun beats down, the air is humid, and the work is relentless. But when you see the plants perk up after a good watering, their leaves regaining their turgor, you feel a sense of satisfaction. You are the engine of this incredible productivity, the human pump keeping this floating garden alive, and tomorrow you'll do it all again, and the day after that, and the day after that. Hope you're not afraid of water because you're literally swimming in work. Just kidding, mostly. Right, so your arms ache from the endless scooping and pouring, a rhythm dictated by the sun and the thirst of your plants. You've hydrated everything, chased away the morning dew, and now you can take a brief moment to survey your floating kingdom. It looks good, vibrant green against the calm water. But the work doesn't stop with watering, not even close. Gardening on a lake means a constant battle against the very environment that makes it possible. The water, your lifeblood, also brings challenges. See those edges of your chinampa, the ones painstakingly built up with mud, reeds and willow branches? They are constantly being eroded by the gentle lapping of the water, the occasional ripple from a passing canoe, or even just the movement of fish. Remember our multi-purpose canals from the last breath? They're busy, like building sandcastles. But if the tide never really went out and you plan to live on them forever, so regular reinforcement is key. You spend time collecting more reeds, weaving them into mats or bundles, and packing them tightly along the sides. You scoop up fresh mud from the canal bed, often the same mud you used for watering, and plaster it over the reeds, smoothing it down. It's like giving your little island a never-ending mud facial. But instead of wrinkle prevention, it's preventing your entire farm from dissolving into the lake. And the canals themselves, while they provide water and nutrients, they also accumulate sediment. All that organic matter, all the bits of plant life, let's just say city runoff. It settles at the bottom. If you don't keep the canals clear, they become shallow, slowing canoe traffic, making it harder to scoop water, and eventually, if neglected for too long, turning into marshland. This is not a one-person job. Canal maintenance is a large-scale, community-wide effort. It requires coordinated labour, sometimes involving thousands of people working together. Think of it as the ancient Aztec equivalent of your neighbourhood's annual Clean the Storm Drains Day. But on a truly epic scale, with wooden shovels and lots of mud. This massive organised effort to dredge and maintain the canal network was absolutely critical to the entire Chinampa system. A mainstream historical fact that highlights the sophisticated level of societal organisation required to sustain Tenochtitlan. Imagine hundreds, perhaps thousands of people, shoulder to shoulder, maybe in shifts, using long poles with scoop nets or large baskets, pulling thick, black, nutrient-rich muck from the canal beds. It's back-breaking, smelly work, but essential. And where does all that glorious muck go? Right back onto the Chinampas, of course. It's piled onto the beds, adding another layer of incredibly fertile soil, replenishing the nutrients that the intensive cropping extracts. It's a beautiful, if messy, cycle. The waste from the city feeds the canals, the dredged sediment from the canals feeds the farms, and the farms feed the city. A closed-loop system long before anyone used that term. Just try not to think too hard about what was in that sediment while you're spreading it on your vegetable patch. Yum. Beyond the structural upkeep, there's the constant battle against nature's less cooperative elements, pests and diseases. Just like today, aphids loved young leaves, caterpillars munched through maize silks, and various blights could threaten an entire harvest. You didn't have chemical pesticides, obviously. Your tools were observation, biological understanding, and perhaps a bit of ancient ingenuity. You'd spend time inspecting your plants, looking for telltale signs of infestation. Spotting pests early was key. A quirky or fringe tidbit here involves their potential use of companion planting and a natural repellents. While definitive proof is scarce, evidence suggests the Aztecs understood that certain plants, when grown together, could deter pests or attract beneficial insects. Marigolds, for instance, are known to repel nematodes and other harmful critters in their roots, and some historical accounts mention their cultivation. Did they know why it worked scientifically? Probably not in modern terms, but they likely observed the effect over generations and incorporated it into their practices. You might intersperse your rows of maize and beans with specific flowering plants or aromatic herbs, not just for decoration, though aesthetics were appreciated, but as a living shield for your food crops. It's like your grandma's gardening tips, but with potentially more human sacrifice involved in other aspects of life. Thankfully, probably not for getting rid of spider mites. Dealing with diseases was harder. If a plant was clearly infected, you'd likely remove it immediately to prevent the spread, an early form of quarantine. Sometimes the only solution was prayer or offerings to the gods, hoping for divine intervention when faced with something unstoppable like a widespread fungal blight. You'd also rely on the genetic diversity of your seeds, planting different varieties that might have varying levels of resistance. It wasn't foolproof, but it was a pragmatic approach based on centuries of accumulated agricultural knowledge. Historians still argue whether the sheer volume of agricultural output on the China Pass was primarily due to this intensive year-round cultivation and manual irrigation, or if it was equally dependent on the highly effective organization of labor for infrastructure maintenance and pest control. Was it the farming techniques themselves, or the management system that made it all work? It's a complex chicken and egg situation that scholars love to chew on, usually over very strong coffee, far away from any potential sediment-rich mud. For you, though, knee-deep in mud from reinforcing an edge or carefully picking beetle larvae off a squash leaf, it's simply the never-ending chore list of being a Chinampa farmer. You pull weeds aggressively because competition for nutrients is fierce. You prune back plants to encourage better fruiting. You keep an eye on the water level, making sure it's just right for your specific crops. You're not just a gardener, you're an engineer, a sanitation worker, a pest control expert, and a botanist, all rolled into one very tired, very muddy package. It's a life of constant vigilance, constant work, but also constant connection to the earth and the water that sustains you and the millions in the great city. You can practically hear the plants whispering thank you as you work. Or maybe that's just the water sloshing. Hard to tell sometimes. The sun climbs higher, warming your face and chasing away the last tendrils of mist from the water. All that painstaking work from the previous days and weeks, the scooping and irrigating, the weeding and pest control, it's all leading to this moment. The vibrant green you saw earlier is punctuated by the promise of food. The plump, ripening ears of maize, the swollen pods of beans hanging heavy on their vines, the glossy deep red chilies ready to be plucked, the enormous gourds nestled amongst their broad leaves. It's harvest time, or at least a harvest time, because on these floating farms, the growing season isn't confined to just one burst of activity. Thanks to the incredibly fertile soil, constantly replenished with that lovely muddy dredge from the canals, remember that, the smelly wonderful stuff, and the reliable access to water, you can grow crops year-round. This isn't like your backyard garden where everything comes in for a few weeks in summer. Here, you're managing multiple plantings, multiple varieties, staggering your crops so there's always something ready to be picked. One section might be lush with young sprouts, while another is heavy with mature vegetables. It's a constant cycle, a continuous stream of produce flowing from the Chinampa. This ability to achieve multiple overlapping harvests throughout the year was a fundamental reason the Chinampa system could support such a massive urban population a mainstream historical fact that sometimes gets lost in the romance of floating gardens. It was about sheer relentless productivity. You move through your rows, your fingers expertly assessing ripeness. You snap the ears of corn from their stalks, the dry husks rustling. You carefully pull the bean pods, making sure not to damage the delicate vines. The chilies require a bit more care, their heat already potent even in the morning air. You gather gourds and squash, hefting their surprisingly substantial weight. For crops like amaranth or chia, which are harvested for their seeds, the process is different, cutting the stalks and carefully collecting the tiny, nutrient-dense grains. It's a manual process, done with simple tools, often just your hands or a sharp obsidian knife for cutting tougher stalks. You move with practiced efficiency, gathering the bounty into baskets or woven mats. You're like a human combine harvester, but way less noisy and with a much better view. As you harvest, you're also thinking about quality. Bruised produce won't sell well at the market. Damaged goods might spoil before they reach the city. So you handle everything with care, sorting as you go, setting aside anything that's not quite perfect, which might still be used at home, of course. Waste not, want not. You might wash some of the root vegetables gently in the canal water, or wipe down gourds. Presentation matters, even in the 15th century. People want good-looking food, not bruised disappointments that look like they went 10 rounds with a jaguar cub. Once the harvest is complete, or at least the day's portion of it, the real logistics begin. This isn't just about feeding your family, it's about contributing to the food supply of a metropolis of maybe 200,000 people or more. All this food needs to get from these scattered islands of cultivation to the heart of the city. And the primary highway? The water itself. Your canoe, probably tied up nearby, becomes your truck, your delivery van, your everything. You carefully load the baskets and mats filled with produce onto the flat-bottomed boat, balancing the weight so it doesn't tip precariously. A heavily laden canoe can be tricky to manage, especially if you're carrying a lot of bulky squash. One wrong shift and you could end up with a boat full of watery gazpacho and a very bad day. You push off from the edge of your chinampa, the paddle dipping smoothly into the water. You join a growing stream of other canoes, all laden with the fruits and vegetables of their labour. There are farmers like you, their boats piled high with maize, beans, tomatoes, chilies, flowers and other goods. There are fishermen with their catch, artisans with their crafts, people heading to visit family, or simply travelling from one part of the interconnected lake system to another. The canals are the arteries of this floating world teeming with activity. It's a constant hum of paddles, quiet conversation, maybe the call of a vendor selling tortillas from a small boat. It's rush hour Aztec style, and probably less road rage than you're used to. Your destination is one of the city's markets, most likely the massive, famous market of Tlatelolco, located just north of the main temple precinct in Tenochtitlan. This wasn't just a market, it was an economic powerhouse, a hub for trade from all over Mesoamerica. Getting there requires navigating a network of canals and perhaps even passing under causeways that link the islands together. You paddle steadily, the rhythm hypnotic. You pass other chinampas, their owners busy with their own harvesting or maintenance. You see larger cargo canoes, perhaps bringing goods from more distant regions or building materials. A quirky or fringe tidbit about this journey. While most accounts focus on food, chinampas were also major producers of flowers. The Aztecs had a deep appreciation for flowers, using them in religious ceremonies, for decoration, and even wearing them as adornments. Canoes laden purely with vibrant, fragrant blossoms were a common sight on the canals heading to market, adding splashes of colour to the scene. Imagine your commute involving dodging boats overflowing with marigolds and dahlias. Smells much better than exhaust fumes, right? The question of just how efficient this vast network of water transport and distribution was is something historians still argue, whether its capacity truly matched the city's enormous and constantly growing demand, or if there were periods of stress on the system. Was the flow of food smooth and reliable, or were there bottlenecks and shortages despite the incredible productivity? It's hard to say definitively from the historical record, but the fact that Tenochtitlan thrived for so long suggests it worked remarkably well most of the time. As you approach the city's edge, the canoe traffic thickens. The sounds change, more voices, the distant murmur of the city, maybe the sound of hammers or construction. You glide along the final canal sections, pulling up alongside a designated unloading area near the market. You join a line of other vendors, waiting your turn to offload your precious cargo. This produce isn't just food, it's your livelihood. It represents days, weeks, months of backbreaking work. And soon, it will be nourishing the people of the greatest city in the Americas. You take a deep breath, smelling the mix of fresh water, damp earth, and ripening vegetables. The journey from the farm to the table, or at least the market stall, is nearly complete. Time to haul this stuff ashore and haggle, hope your biceps are ready. You maneuver your canoe into the designated spot, tying it off alongside dozens of others. The air immediately changes. Gone is the quiet lapping of water and the smell of damp earth and ripening plants. Here the air is thick with 1,000 different scents. Roasting maize, pungent herbs, sweet fruits, the earthy smell of pottery, the faint metallic tang of obsidian blades, and the unmistakable, sometimes overwhelming aroma of, well, a really big, busy place filled with people and goods. The noise level is incredible. It's a constant surging tide of voices, bartering, calling out wares, greeting friends, arguing, laughing. If your Chenampa was your peaceful office cubicle, Tlatelolco is Grand Central Station during rush hour, but way older and with more live turkeys. You heft your baskets and mats of produce from the boat, carrying them through the dense crowd. People are everywhere, moving in a chaotic flow that somehow works. You see farmers like yourself unloading their goods. You see merchants with more permanent stalls laden with crafts, pottery, textiles, woven-paired mats, featherwork that shimmers with impossible colours. There are sellers of tools and weapons made from obsidian. There are jewelers with gold and silver ornaments. There are vendors selling prepared food, tortillas, tamales, stews, snacks you don't even recognize. It's a full sensory explosion, enough to wake you up if you weren't already stimulated by carrying 50 pounds of squash through a throng of people. This place, Tlatelolco, wasn't just a market, it was the economic heart of the Aztec world. A mainstream historical fact often cited as one of the largest and most organized markets in the pre-Columbian Americas. Spanish chroniclers, like Bernal Diaz del Castillo, who saw it with their own eyes, were absolutely stunned by its size, order, and the sheer variety of goods available. They described it as being bigger and better regulated than any market they'd seen in Europe. Imagine stumbling out of your small village market and into something the size of several football fields, packed shoulder to shoulder with everything you could possibly need, want, or never knew existed. It was mind-boggling. You find your usual spot, a designated area for Chinampa produce, and carefully arrange your harvest. You lay out the corn ears, pile the beans, arrange the chilies by size and colour. You make sure the most attractive gourds are visible. Presentation, remember? You squat down, ready for the day's work, selling. You might call out softly to passers-by, advertising your fresh goods. Buyers approach, examining the produce, picking up ears of corn, sniffing herbs, checking the firmness of a tomato. The process of exchange here is fascinating. Money as we know it didn't exist in the form of minted coins. Barter was common. You might trade some of your beans for someone else's pottery or your chilies for a fishing net. But for standardized value and smaller transactions, cacao beans were widely used. Yes, chocolate money. A handful of beans for some chilies, a small bag for a basket of corn. For larger transactions, standardized lengths of cotton cloth, or sometimes even copper axes, were used as a form of currency. So imagine paying for your groceries with a handful of M&Ms. Sounds delicious, right? A quirky or fringe tidbit about this system is that, like any currency, cacao beans could be faked. Unscrupulous individuals would sometimes hollow out the beans and fill them with something worthless, like dirt or sand. There were even market officials whose job it was, in part, to spot these fakes. Talk about needing a keen eye for beans. As you interact with buyers, the haggling begins. Someone offers too little for your corn, you counter. They point out a small blemish on a gourd which you totally didn't see, obviously. You explain that this particular gourd variety is supposed to look like that. It's a sign of quality, actually. It's a dance, a negotiation, a constant back and forth trying to get the best value for your hard-earned harvest. The noise of countless similar negotiations creates that constant murmur that fills the air. Historians still argue whether the Aztec market system, particularly in massive hubs like Tlatelolco, was truly a free market in the modern sense, or if it was heavily regulated by state officials, the Pochteca, long-distance merchants who had their own rules and influence, or even temple authorities. Were prices strictly controlled, or did supply and demand truly dictate Vishundan value? How effective were the market officials at preventing fraud and ensuring fair trade? It's a complex picture, and pinning down the exact balance of regulation and freedom is tricky with the available sources. You see the variety of people, commoners buying their daily food, Wealthy merchants in finer clothing, perhaps even priests or nobles, accompanied by attendants shopping for items for rituals or their households. You might see a Pochteca merchant returning from a long journey, displaying goods from faraway lands, jade from Guatemala, turquoise from the north, exotic bird feathers from the rainforests. It's a reminder that your little patch of floating farm is just one piece of a vast interconnected economic network. The market officials, known as tianquistli, are visible too, patrolling the aisles. They wore distinct clothing and carried staffs of office. Their role was to maintain order, settle disputes between buyers and sellers, and check the quality and measure of goods. You definitely don't want to get on their bad side. They had the authority to punish dishonest vendors, sometimes quite severely. It's like having market police, but they're probably less interested in giving you a parking ticket and more interested in whether your cacao beans are suspiciously lightweight. The sheer volume of goods moving through here is staggering. Think about it. A city the size of Tenochtitlan needed to be fed every single day. The Chinampas provided a huge portion of the fresh produce, but goods also came in from tribute from conquered territories and trade with allied or independent regions. All converging here. You sell your first basket of chilies, then some beans. The cacao beans are exchanged, small, dark, and valuable. You stash them carefully in a small pouch. It's not exactly a wallet, but it serves the purpose. As the morning wears on, the sun gets higher, and the market gets even busier. The smells intensify, the noise swells. You might take a break to grab a quick bite from a food vendor, maybe some hot tortillas or a small bowl of something savory. It's refueling for the next round of selling. The market isn't just a place of commerce. It's a social hub, a place to hear news, gossip, and connect with people from all walks of life. But right now, your focus is on emptying those baskets and making sure your trip wasn't just a nice boat ride with a heavy load. The market day wears on, and you continue your quiet hustle. The sun climbs higher, then begins its slow descent. The noise level somehow manages to stay consistently deafening. It's less frantic shouting now, maybe a bit more tired bartering, punctuated by the occasional cry of a vendor trying to offload their last few items before packing up. You've sold most of your produce, the baskets looking significantly lighter than when you arrived. You count the small piles of cacao beans you've accumulated, maybe tuck a few lengths of cotton cloth into your bundle. It's not a fortune, but it's enough. Enough to trade for supplies you need, maybe some new weaving reeds, a sharper obsidian blade for cutting, or a warm cloak for the cooler evenings, enough to sustain your life on the water. You pack up your remaining goods, strapping the lighter baskets back into your canoe. The process of leaving the market is almost as chaotic as arriving. You have to navigate through the still dense crowds, apologizing as you bump shoulders, sidestepping vendors packing up their wares, avoiding a stack of precarious pottery or a wandering turkey. They were everywhere, apparently. Slowly, you work your way back towards the canal where you tied your boat. It feels like swimming upstream through a human river, but you've done this countless times. It's just part of the rhythm. Finally, you reach the canal edge. Untying your canoe, you push off into the waterway, and immediately the atmosphere shifts again. The cacophony of the market fades behind you, replaced by the familiar sounds of the water, the soft dip of your paddle, the gentle lapping against the hull, the distant calls of birds. The air clears too, losing the thick blend of market smells and returning to the fresh, clean scent of water, mud, and growing plants. It's like stepping out of a nightclub and into a quiet park, just, centuries ago, and with more potential jaguars. You paddle away from the main docks of Tlatelolco, leaving the towering temples and bustling squares behind. The canals here are still busy, but with a different kind of traffic. Other canoes, some laden with goods, others simply transporting people, maybe families returning home or fishermen heading out for the evening catch. It's a watery highway system, intricate and essential to the life of Tenochtitlan. This network of canals connected the island city to its periphery and the Chinampa zones, a sophisticated transportation system that amazed the Spanish invaders. It's a mainstream historical fact that these waterways were the lifeblood of the Aztec capital, far more efficient for moving goods and people than any European city of the time could boast with its muddy, crowded streets. As you paddle further from the city centre, the buildings thin out. You pass residential areas built along the canal banks, thatched roofs and adobe walls reflecting in the water. People are going about their evening routines, women washing clothes at the water's edge, children playing near the banks, men mending nets or preparing tools. You exchange nods or brief greetings with those you pass. It's a community connected by water. The landscape begins to change. The dense urban environment gives way to scattered houses, then open water punctuated by reeds, and eventually the familiar checkerboard pattern of the Chinampus begins to appear on the horizon. Remember those rectangular islands we talked about? They spread out before you, green and lush against the darkening sky. It's a sight that always brings a sense of peace, a return to your own corner of the world after the intensity of the market. You've exchanged the energy of thousands for the quiet solitude of your floating farm. Paddling through the Chinampa zone feels different. The canals here are smaller, quieter. The water is still, reflecting the plants that grow right up to the edge. You can see other farmers, maybe tending to a few tasks before nightfall, or simply enjoying the evening air. The smell here is predominantly that of damp earth, rich mud and vegetation. Green, growing, alive. You might hear the buzzing of insects or the splash of a fish in the water. It's a complete sensory shift from the market. A quirky or fringe tidbit about the waterways surrounding the Chenampes is that they weren't just transportation routes. They were also actively managed aquatic ecosystems. People harvested fish and crustaceans from these waters, used the reeds growing along the banks for weaving and construction, and even collected algae like spirulina, which was a valuable source of protein and a common food item. The water wasn't just empty space between the farms, it was part of the productive landscape itself. Talk about multitasking water, historians still argue whether the scale and intensity of Chinampa farming, combined with the pressures of feeding a massive urban population like Tenochtitlan, were truly sustainable in the long term, especially considering environmental factors and potential changes in water levels or salinity in the lake system. Could this incredibly productive system have continued indefinitely, without significant ecological consequences, or was it always balancing on a knife's edge? It's a question that modern agricultural science still grapples with: how to feed a growing population sustainably. The Aztecs were wrestling with versions of these same issues millennia ago. As you paddle down the narrow channel towards your specific plot, you pass your neighbour's Chinampas. You see their crops, maybe comment on how well their beans are doing, or commiserate about a recent patch of pests. It's a shared experience, this unique way of farming. You belong to a community of Chinampa dwellers, experts in turning watery marshes into incredibly fertile land. It takes specific knowledge, knowing when to dredge the canals, how to build and maintain the layers of organic matter, what crops grow best in this environment. It's knowledge passed down through generations, practical wisdom honed over centuries. It's definitely not the kind of thing you learn from scrolling TikTok tutorials, though I'm sure someone would try to make a Chinampa hacks video if they could time travel. The sun is sinking lower now, casting long shadows across the water. The sky is probably turning some spectacular shades of orange and purple over the distant volcanoes, a view you get used to out here. You finally reach your own Chinampa. It looks peaceful, settled, familiar. Your day of labour, market hustle, and paddling is coming to an end. You tie off your canoe, step onto the solid, fertile ground you helped create. The air is cool and damp. The work isn't entirely done yet, of course. There are still evening chores, maybe checking the irrigation channels or shooing away any persistent birds, but the main effort is past. You look across your fields, seeing the healthy plants, the promise of future harvests. It's a connection to the land, or water in this case, that's deep and fundamental. You've spent the day interacting with thousands of people, a crucial part of the larger Aztec society. But now, you're back in the quiet, productive space that is uniquely yours. The contrast between the bustling city and the tranquil farms couldn't be starker, highlighting the dual nature of Aztec life. Vibrant urban centres supported by ingenious agricultural systems like these floating gardens. And you, the Chinampa farmer, were the essential link, the bridge between the mud and the marketplace, the quiet labour and the vibrant trade. Your journey today is a microcosm of the Aztec economy, fueled by your backbreaking work and clever techniques. You step onto the rich, dark soil of your Chinampa, the damp earth cool beneath your feet. The vibrant energy of the market feels worlds away now, replaced by a profound stillness, broken only by the gentle sounds of the evening. Crickets are beginning their chorus, a steady, rhythmic buzz that feels like the pulse of the wetland. Maybe you hear the distant call of a heron, or the soft rustling of cornstalks in a faint breeze. The air smells of decay and new growth, a potent, earthy perfume unique to these floating fields. It's the smell of life itself, perpetually renewing. The light is fading fast now. The sky, which earlier was a fiery canvas of sunset colours, is deepening into twilight blues and purples. The silhouettes of the distant volcanoes are stark against the horizon. You walk along the narrow pathways between your rows of crops, tall maize stalks sighing softly, beans climbing their poles, squash plants spreading wide leaves. Everything looks lush and healthy, a testament to your hard work and the incredible fertility of this land. You run a hand over a corn leaf, feeling its rough texture. This is the food that feeds your family, that you took to market today. It's a direct connection to the cycle of life and sustenance. There are still a few small tasks to complete before night fully descends. You might check the water level in a small irrigation channel, ensuring it's flowing properly. Maybe you spend a few minutes pulling a persistent weed or two, even in the dim light. It's a farmer's instinct, always tending to the land. You might gather a few last-minute greens for the evening meal, plucking them fresh from the soil. This immediate access to food is one of the great advantages of living on a chinampa. Your pantry is literally all around you. You paddle your canoe closer to the small dwelling on your chinampa, perhaps a simple reed or adobe structure, designed to be sturdy yet adaptable to the watery environment. Smoke might be curling lazily from a small hearth inside, where someone is likely preparing the evening meal. The thought of warm food and rest after a long day is a comforting one. As you secure the canoe, you take a moment to just look at your surroundings. The other chinampas are quiet too, their lights, maybe simple reed torches or small fires, beginning to twinkle across the water like scattered stars. Being a chinampa farmer wasn't just a job, it was a way of life, deeply intertwined with the natural world and the rhythms of the lake. You had to be attuned to the water levels, the weather patterns, the needs of your plants. It required constant attention and physical labor, from dredging mud to planting seeds to harvesting crops. But there was also a profound connection to the environment, a partnership with the lake and the land you created upon it. It wasn't always easy. Pests, floods, or droughts could threaten your livelihood. But when the harvest was good, the rewards were immense. A quirky or fringe tidbit about chinampa life is that families often kept ducks or other fowl right on their plots, sometimes even semi-wild, allowing them to forage in the shallow waters around the edges, where they would help control insect populations and their waste would add to the fertility of the channels. Imagine your pest control being method and quacking. It's another example of how the chinampa system integrated different elements into a sustainable, productive whole. You step inside your dwelling, it's simple, perhaps just a single room with woven mats for sleeping and a hearth for cooking. But it's dry and safe, your sanctuary after a day out in the world. You greet your family, the familiar faces a welcome sight. Maybe there are children playing softly or an elder tending the fire. The smell of cooking maize or beans fills the air. You shed your work clothes, perhaps splash water on your face from a clay pot. The day's grime washes away, and you feel the tension begin to ease from your muscles. Eating dinner together, perhaps a simple meal of tortillas, beans, vegetables from the chinampa, and maybe some fish from the canal, you share stories of the day. You talk about the market, the prices, who you saw, maybe a funny interaction, or a piece of news you overheard. It's a moment of connection and shared life, the family unit at the center of everything. For the Aztecs, like many pre-industrial societies, family and community were the bedrock. Historians still argue whether the Aztec state actively controlled the chinampa system, dictating what crops were grown and how much tribute was owed, or if it was a more decentralized system driven primarily by individual family initiative and local community organization. Was it a top-down agricultural command economy, or a bottom-up farmer-led enterprise with state oversight? Understanding this dynamic helps us grasp the true nature of Aztec governance and the daily lives of people like you. Were you a relatively free farmer selling your surplus, or an essential cog in a tightly managed imperial food machine? As the evening deepens, the sounds outside shift. The crickets continue their relentless chirping, joined perhaps by the distant hoot of an owl. The water is almost completely still now, reflecting the rising moon and the stars beginning to populate the dark sky. There's a profound sense of peace, a quiet satisfaction that comes from hard work and a belly full of food grown with your own hands. You think about the journey to the market, the bustling city, the thousands of people, and then contrast it with this quiet, watery world you inhabit. Both are essential parts of the same complex civilization. You prepare for sleep. Mats are unrolled, simple blankets laid out. The fire is banked down to glowing embers. The sounds of the night filter in, the lapping of water, the rustling of leaves, the myriad voices of insects and amphibians. Your body is tired from the physical labor and the long day. Your mind might still replay moments from the market or plan tasks for tomorrow on the Chinampa, but gradually the thoughts begin to slow, the senses soften. You are safe, you are home, surrounded by the land you cultivate and the water that sustains it all. The journey through the Aztec world, from the mud of your farm to the heart of the empire's trade and back again, has ended for the day. You close your eyes, letting the gentle rhythm of the Chinampa carry you towards rest. The sounds of the Chinampa fade into a gentle hush. The cricket's song becomes a soft, pulsing wave. The water's lapping slows, smoothing out like silk. The feeling of damp earth and growing plants softens, becoming a distant memory, a quiet dream taking shape. Your body feels heavy now, sinking deeper into softness. The thoughts of ancient markets, bustling canals, and ingenious floating farms drift away, like smoke on a still evening breeze. There's nowhere else to be, nothing left to do. Just this stillness, this quiet drifting. The images soften, the colours dim, leaving only a peaceful, quiet dark. Let the sounds and sensations fade completely now. You are safer, you are quiet, you are still. Just breathe soft and slow. Let sleep find you easily, like a canoe gliding into a calm harbour. Let the peace of the ancient world, the gentle rhythm of the water and the earth, lull you into deep rest. All is quiet now. All is calm. Sleep well.